All right, wonderful. It is 11 o'clock here in New York. We're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lily Alpert. I'm a senior researcher at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And thank you so much for everyone from around the country who I can see showing up this morning. It's a great crowd for making the time for this morning's presentation, Measure Twice and Cut Once, using the Major Outcomes Report to unlock new knowledge and action. In a second, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleagues, Jennifer Haight and Sara Feldman, who are going to walk you through today one of the data center's core products, the Major Outcomes Report, talk a bit about its utility and how it can support states in the field. And so I'll turn the presentation over to them. We have a lot of folks on the line today, which is fantastic. We're going to leave some time at the end of the session for Q&A. And so I'll help to moderate that. If you have questions along the way, please, by all means, jot them down in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar administration setup, and we'll get to as many as possible when the session's over. So without further ado, Sara and Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer. I just want to reiterate Lily's gratitude. Thank you for taking the time to come and to hear what we have to say about the Major Outcomes Report. We really appreciate it. What the focus of this call is this Major Outcomes Report. Some of you, those of you who are FCDA members already, will have gotten a copy of it. And we just want to spend a little bit of time explaining to you what it is and what some of its benefits are, what we think you can use it for. Our title, Measure Twice, Cut Once, sort of refers to this admonition to tailors to be very careful before they make their first cut in the fabric, so that the garment that they're making does not have to be redone, wasting resources and time because they did not correctly measure the figure for which they were fitting the garment. That relates to this in a couple of ways. First of all, it's important when you launch a new initiative or even change a process that you're expecting all of the folks in your field to do, that you have correctly matched the thing that you're asking them to do with the problem or the situation that you're trying to address. Because we all know that folks are busy, they don't have time to keep doing new things to solving different versions of the problem they think that they might have. So you want to measure twice. You want to be sure that the thing that you're doing is going to solve the problem that you have. So one of the our admonitions to sort of the child welfare tailors in the room is to be deliberate and careful, and to know that you're relying on the best possible evidence, the best resource that you have, that you can be confident that has reliably transformed the data that you have in your system into actionable knowledge or research evidence from which you can then, if you're a tailor, make your cuts, or if you're a child welfare administrator, make your investments, ask your staff to do something different or do something new, and understand that it has a better likelihood of connecting to the thing that you want to address, or the problem that you want to solve, or the thing that you want to keep doing well. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I want to just speak briefly about our agenda, which is the next slide.
One second, Jennifer. We're just having a moment of technical, there we go.
Okay. So as I said, some of you have a copy of this Major Outcomes Report, but those of you who don't worry, we have slides for that. So we're going to go over what is in this Major Outcomes Report. And as I said, we're going to talk about some of the benefits of using the Major Outcomes Report, which will, we hope, we've observed in other jurisdictions, fuel the process of improvement, or what we sometimes call support your CQI efforts. The first thing that you need to do when you want to continue the process of improvement, because I think all of us at the data center, but I think in general from our experience working in the field, there's always a commitment to get better, to do better. There's always interest in improving outcomes for children and families we serve, which sometimes I just refer to as getting better. Not because we aren't already good, but because our clients always deserve our best efforts to get better. And in order to get better, the first thing you have to do is know something, is have sort of deep knowledge about your system. We sometimes call that working knowledge. And there's lots of different kinds of knowledge actors in the system have. What we're talking about is sort of specific to some core outcomes, but it's important to know what's typical, what is typically true of child welfare systems in general, and my child welfare system in particular will arm you with essential information that allows you first to be alert to something that's different, or to be informed when you're interacting with stakeholders about what is typically true. And that helps you sort of be on the lookout for opportunities to keep doing something well, or to do something different, or to ask more questions about whether what you're seeing in your system is what you'd expect to see or what you want to see. And once if you have this, this resource, you are equipping yourself with a very high level but essential set of information that lets you know what's typical in your system. And as I said, allows you to identify where you might want to ask more questions to sort of pursue an opportunity to do something different. We also understand that the process of improvement is exactly that. It's a process. So the major outcomes report helps you understand what's typical, alerts you to where you might want to do something different, and inspires you, it's kind of a lofty word, but I'm going to stick with it, inspires you to ask more questions that will, in some instances, allow you to make better use or deeper use of some of the resources that the data center can connect you with to build your own capacity for asking and answering questions and using that knowledge to drive continuous improvement in your field. And then finally, what we'll end with is a recap and next steps. And those of you who may have seen some of the work that we've done in the field will know that we're big on recapping and next steps. So we'll make sure we hit that. Repetition, after all, is something. Okay, so I have a couple of slides here that sort of give an overview of the major outcomes report. First of all, it is a report that, at its most basic, both asks and answers a set of basic, foundational, mission-critical questions about outcomes for children in foster care. And we understand that child welfare systems are responsible and obligated to be attentive to more than just the experience of children in foster care. There's a lot of other opportunities for children and families in their communities to interact with the child welfare system. So in this case, we're pretty specific about what happens after a child has been removed from his or her home to be temporarily in the custody of the state, and to understand what typically happens next. These relate to the core questions that the federal government is interested in, but also that state and local jurisdictions are interested in, and more specifically connect directly to the safety and permanency for the children and families that we're working with. So they relate to how children come into care, that is how they come to be, they get the, how many children are removed, basically, the flow in, the flow out, when they leave, and the caseload that is a consequence of this dynamic of kids coming into care and kids leaving care. These are all fundamental things that you want to know, and you want to know what has been typically true. We'll talk about the length of stay. Foundational outcome is related to the duration in this temporary state custody. How long do children stay? We'll look at permanency. When they are removed, they eventually leave after some period of time. Where do they go? Do they have a permanent exit? Is it a reunification or adoption? How many have a different kind of exit? Those questions are answered in the outcome workbook. Placement stability. When they are in care, what is their experience while in care? Are they likely to have a disruption or not? And finally, reentry. When they leave care, if they leave to a permanent exit, and most children do, how likely is it that they're going to reenter? So these are the core outcomes that are in the major outcomes report, and that Sarah is going to, well, both Sarah and I will review with you in a couple of minutes. But the next slide, before we get to that, I just want to reiterate, or iterate and then reiterate, that the major outcomes report, that I wouldn't be fully doing my job if I didn't also explain in this overview that not only does the major outcomes report contain information about foundational outcomes in the child welfare system, but it does so in a way that reflects our commitment to best practices in measurement, which themselves are sort of based on some fundamental principles, or what we often call priority concepts, that relate to the process of improvement and specifically to the process of measurement. So some of you who have been exposed to any of us before, or other members of the data center, this will sound sort of familiar, and that's great. We think that they're foundational and that they should sort of be part of the approach to the process of improvement. So first of all, there's this obvious, or sometimes obvious, concept of stating your question first. And that actually is preceded a little bit by by what it is that you want to know. We know that we want to know about core outcomes, but we're suggesting that to get better at deriving information and making use of it, that you actually state what you want to know in the form of a question, because that the question is what helps you to make decisions about how to measure something. So know what you want to know and then put it in the form of a question and write that question down, actually. That can be helpful. And then when you're talking, when you or your analyst is going to answer the question, you've sort of already armed them with information that's going to lead them to make the best choice in producing for you the answer to the question. Because as you write your question down and turn it into an analytic question, you have to be clear about whom you're asking the question, and that's the next concept. Know the population from which you are measuring. Sometimes we call this the risk set. Sometimes we call it the denominator. That's not its most popular name. But the point is that with respect to both asking a good analytic question and following the rules of good measurement, you have to make sure that the population that you are measuring includes everyone who is at risk of the phenomena you care about. So I'm going to just say that again, because it's not necessarily super obvious, and it requires you to take some care in that effort to write the question down. So you want to know the population who's at risk of the thing that you care about, your general interest. So if you care about kids entering foster care, how likely is it that a child in my community is going to come into foster care, because that speaks to safety in the community, a safety issue, but also sort of what happens next. Then you want to know who's at risk of being removed and placed into foster care. And that is all the children in the community. If you want to know what happens to children after they have come into foster care, and that's really the focus of the major outcomes report, what's going to happen to these children who we've decided can't stay safely in their community, and we want to bring them into the state's custody for temporary care before we can locate a permanent safe home for them. Then we start asking questions about what's likely to happen to that group of kids. That's all of them, the entry cohort. If we want to understand what typically happens to children our system serves, and we do want to understand that because that builds our working knowledge, then we want to look at everybody, all the children who entered care. How long does it take for them to leave? When they leave, where do they go? Are they likely to move? And then if we're interested in re-entry, which I said that we are, that's when you might identify a different population. Who's at risk of re-entering care? Well, those who exit, and maybe we want to focus specifically on reunification. So we could look at all the kids who exited to reunification. I'm just noting that these two concepts, know the population and generally using entry cohorts, are sort of essential to get sort of square in your head, so that when you're writing your analytic question down and going to answer it, you're clear that you're capturing the right information, that your measure is actually producing the knowledge you want to know. The next concept, stratification, just reminds us that in our effort to understand what's typical, there are also subpopulations that themselves have very distinct pathways through the system. All of us know from our work, either interacting with systems, managing systems, and actually working directly with children and families, that a child who's removed and placed into care as an infant likely has a very different pathway from a child who's removed and placed into care as a teenager. And so we want to know what those pathways are in general and specifically for our system. And we also want to understand whether the mix of children entering care has changed from year to year. Because knowing what's typical and understanding these changes in case mix are going to help us understand more clearly, paint a better picture about what's happening in our system as we try to identify areas for improvement. Remember, we're measuring a lot, so we're hoping to only cut once, measure multiple times. Stratification helps us in that goal. And finally, likelihood or probability. You have certainly already heard me use those terms. How likely is it? What is the probability that the child will have this experience? Those terms are not accidents. The care with which we measure will structure the measures that answer the questions we pose, allows us to make statements about probability or to be predictive. If we know what has typically been true of our system, we can use that information to predict what's going to happen next. And if we want to do something different, we can rely on that past, those past metrics to help us understand what will happen if we don't change and where we might want to invest some effort if we would like to see change. So these concepts are fundamental to not only how we structure the metrics, but then, but to sort of engaging in this ongoing process of continuous improvement. So that's sort of a general overview of the outcomes report, both sort of the particular outcomes that we focus on and the approach, which is the foundation on which the report is built. So we're going to go to the next slide, which begins to describe in more detail the outcome report.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good morning, everybody. This is Sara Feldman, also of the Data Center. So we're going to start looking at the major outcomes report, or at least the components of it now. And we want to spend just a couple of minutes giving you a high-level overview of the kind of information you can find in a major outcomes report. So first, we include a preface tab that gives you basic information about the database we use to generate the information, such as how current the database is, as well as any other important rules we used in the way we constructed the database, particularly around the way we constructed what we refer to as foster care spells, or what you might think of as discrete experiences in out-of-home care. Importantly, the major outcomes report includes a full set of notes on the measurement practices we use to derive the information contained in each of the performance-related tabs. We're going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, but for now I'll just say that the measurement notes that we include in the major outcomes report include such information as the kinds of questions you can answer using the information in the major outcomes report, the populations of children that we use to generate the summary information that gets back to what Jennifer was just talking about with regards to the risk set, or what we often call the denominator, and other technical notes. And then also, as Jennifer noted earlier, the major outcomes report contains information at the system, often the statewide level, about admissions and exits, placement stability, lengths of stay in out-of-home care, also known as duration, permanency, and reentry. You see those going across the middle of your screen. And we provide information about system performance along each of these indicators, typically going back about 5 years. And for those of you who are participating in the webinar this morning who received a sample of the major outcomes report, you have in your sample product, I believe, just 5 tabs. You see here that there are 7. Your 5 tabs, I believe, will go over admissions and exits. That would be your overview tab, a moves tab that provides information about placement stability, a duration tab that gives you some information about lengths of stay and out-of-home care, a permanency tab that gives you information on exits, either to reunification, adoption, or relative guardianship, and then finally a reentry tab. So again, we'd like to say just a few more words about the measurement notes that are included in the major outcomes report and the way this element of the report can help child welfare managers and others who would interface with the report to use it to their benefit.
Yeah, so this is really just going to be quick. I just wanted to show a concrete example of this business about how, knowing your question, writing it down, and making a good research and transforming what you want to know into a research question that guides the measurement decision and sort of serves as a reminder that the measure that you've selected correctly answers the question that you've asked. And sometimes, as I said before, and we'll talk about at the end, the questions, there's usually just not one question and one answer and then you're good to go. Questions beget other questions. But some of the more common questions that relate to foundational outcomes, we've decided, we've taken care of that in this report, and we decided very deliberately when we wanted to add sort of notes to help the user make the best use of this report, we decided very deliberately to be clear that we are asking very specific questions that are common but essential to building your knowledge about what's typical in your system. And this is just what you can see, that there are questions that match each table in every tab, and this is just the place where we write them down and show you how we built them. So for example, question A, column A sort of shows you this is basically what we want to know. We want to know about permanency. Column B just tells you the table that answers the question or where you can find that information. And column C contains a list of the questions that are answered by the table. And I am definitely not going to read them out loud or go over them for you, but I'll just note that they are constructed so that they relate directly to the analysis. The way the question's structured, you could, if you're the analyst, build the fraction that answers the question. The denominator, which is in column D, represents the population or the risk set, the group who's at risk of experiencing the thing you want to know more about. And the numerator represents the group of kids that did experience the thing that you want to know about. And then when you turn to that table, you'll actually see the information. I did just want to take this minute that is about to end, along with my speaking about it, to show you how those priority concepts directly translate into what's contained in the workbook. And now we'll go to the workbook and start showing some examples of what's in the workbook and connecting them to the benefits that we alluded to before. So here we've said now several times, remember I did say I'd repeat myself, that one important benefit of the evidence contained in the major outcomes report is that it helps you know what's typical in your system over time. And there's a lot of value to that. It fuels much more productive conversations, both internally and with external stakeholders. And it helps you understand what is likely to happen if you don't do anything different, and help you identify where you might want to do something different or differently. So right here, this is an example of a permanency measure. The bottom part of the slide on the left-hand side shows you the table from the workbook. And I'm just going to go over it a little bit slowly because there's actually quite a bit of information in here. So the column shows the time trend, calendar year. So this, from 2012 to 2016, we're looking at all of the children in each entry cohort who entered care and asking the question, what proportion of those children in each of those entry cohorts exited to permanency within 6 months, within 1 year? These are cumulative. So for 2012, 30% of however many children entered care exited to permanency within 6 months, 42% within 1 year, 57% within 2 years, and so on, all the way out to 5 years. The shaded values, that sort of stepwise shaded values, indicates to you that we haven't fully observed the all of the activity for kids who qualify for this duration interval. So I could say that a little bit better. What it means is that, for example, in 2015, we've observed 46% of the entry cohort have exited within 2 years, but there remain some children who entered in 2015 who could yet exit within 2 years of their entry, because the data that we pulled was pulled at the end of at the end of 2016, I think. So there are still children who qualify for exiting within 2 years who were in care at the time that we created this table. The blank, where there's no data, that means that nobody who entered could yet have exited within 3 years, so we don't report anything. But there's some value to reporting what we have seen so far, because it helps us understand where we're going. And it's important to shade it so we know that it's not a completely observed interval yet. We put a circle around the within 1 year column because that also equates to a current federal measure. It's it does relate to the federal measure that that sets a standard for the achievement of permanency within a year of entry. And you can look down that column and see whether whether you are changing and in what direction the change is happening. The table above just graphs the exits within 1 year, so that it just paints perhaps a more interpretable picture of the data contained in the table below. And it shows that in this jurisdiction, for the last 4 years, just about 40% of children entering care exited to permanency within a year of entry. If you were to make a prediction about what's going to happen for 2016, this graph in the table below allows you to be pretty confident that unless you know of something that's radically different, and it would take a radical difference to change the figure here, that the figure for 2016 is very likely going to be around 40%. In fact, if you wanted to predict for 2017, knowing what you would know about your particular system, it's a pretty good bet that you could make a prediction about that children entering care would exit to permanency within about 40% would exit within a year. And this knowledge could help you structure an improvement goal. It could lead to more questions, but it certainly helps you understand what's typical with respect to permanency for all kids, not only within 1 year, but ultimately out. You can see ultimately that about 67% of children entering in 2012 exited to permanency. You can see that 67% of 2013 have already exited to permanency within 4 years. It's likely to be a little bit higher, but not that much higher, and so on. This provides a more complete picture of the path to permanency for children entering the system, as well as containing this information that is matches what the federal government pays attention to. The next slide also is a demonstration of the value of knowing what's typical in your system. It focuses more on variation across administrative entities. So it's actually the same data about permanency, but rather than the 1 year, we looked at a longer period of time and looked at the difference in the path to permanency for 2 different regions in the same state, or hypothetically, that's what it is. So what the red line shows is that children who entered in the red region had this sort of quick path to permanency. 30% of them exited to permanency within 6 months of their entry, and that incline topped out at about 65% within 4 years. The blue line shows the same entry cohort in the same state, but a different jurisdiction, and it shows a very different path to permanency. It shows that it's much slower, that less than or about 10% of children exited permanency within 6 months, and that it did get steeper, but at a little bit slower rate. Although ultimately, by the 5-year mark, the blue region saw more children exit to permanency within 5 years than the red region did. So this is the kind of information that in our view fuels a lot of additional questions. It helps you understand that while systems have typical pathways over time, that there's variation that will help you understand where you might want to focus and where you might want to and where there's strengths and where there's opportunity to do something different. What this picture shows is that the blue region has a greater likelihood of permanency, a greater proportion of children ultimately leave to permanency, but they do so more slowly. So if you were going to structure an improvement effort in this state, you might do something different in the blue region than you would in the red region. You might want to see some of that, you might want to understand whether there's something different about the children being served, for one thing, but then if you saw that they were similar groups of kids, you might think there's an opportunity to do something faster in the blue region than there is in the red region. This is, as I said, and will continue to repeat, the major outcomes report doesn't answer all the questions you have. It answers some of the questions that you might have about your system in order to help you continue to ask more. And an image such as this would trigger a lot of further questions before you knew exactly what you might want to do differently to reduce the variation, if that's appropriate, and to continue to improve both the time it takes to achieve permanency and the likelihood that children exit to permanency.
Okay, so there's another thing that we want to think about when we think about what's typical for a system, and that's what's typical within what we call these diagnostically relevant groups, right? And that's, thinking about how outcomes vary depending on children's characteristics or attributes that have some kind of clinical significance. For instance, how old children are at the time they enter out-of-home care. So the example that we have here, as you can see, it has to do with lengths of stay. And we use the median length of stay, the median duration, which tells you the amount of time, here we're measuring it in months, that it took half of an entry cohort to exit foster care. So what we see here is that lengths of stay vary based on how old children are when they enter foster care. Year to year, we're seeing that it takes younger children, particularly children who enter foster care as babies, longer to exit foster care than it does older children. In fact, in this sample data, it appears that the median duration for children who enter foster care babies is twice as long as it is for children who enter care for teenagers. Half of the teenagers coming into care in any of the given years displayed here are going to exit foster care within just 8 to 9 months. It's very a different picture for the babies. And so just getting back to what Jennifer was saying earlier about the value of having, or at least noticing, these fairly durable patterns, what's typical for this system is that lengths of stay are significantly longer for the youngest children, fairly variable for the school-age kids, that's the purple trend line that you see, and teenagers consistently have the shortest median duration compared to all other children entering care. So including this kind of information as a part of the working knowledge that you have of your system can go a very long way in helping you target resources where they're needed most. So if you're planning an intervention or if you're thinking about making an investment, you might think about these different groups of kids, these diagnostically relevant groups, in the way that you target your funds. So let's move to the second benefit, identifying the obvious targets for improvement. So we're going to use the example of placement stability here. One of the measures included in the major outcomes report is the conditional probability of an initial move within set intervals of time, such as the 3-month intervals we have here. You see that going along the x-axis along the bottom. So this measure answers the question, given that children are still in care and haven't yet experienced a change in placement at the beginning of a 3-month interval, what is the probability that they will experience their first ever move during that interval? There are various worthwhile strata, or put another way, organizing categories that you could use with this measure. One that we use as a matter of course in the major outcomes report is the age of children at the time they enter care. But here, as you can see in the legend, we're going to use initial placement type as a way to organize the information. And for ease of illustration, we're going to focus just on kinship and non-kinship placement types. We appreciate there are several other placement types that we can consider, but just for the sake of the example, we're going to focus on these two. So this is the conditional probability of an initial move within 3-month intervals for children whose first placement type is kinship. That is, these are the kids who are placed in kinship homes straight away. And now we're going to layer on the conditional probability of an initial move for children whose first placement is in a non-kinship home. So we clearly see that for both sets of children, the first 3 months are when we're most likely to see an initial move occur. However, the probability that a child will experience a move in the first 3 months of their placement in out-of-home care is almost twice as high for children initially placed in non-kinship homes. You can see that the gap between the two lines closes dramatically once we get to that second interval, children who are still in care after 3 months and who have yet to experience a move. You can also see that over the course of that first year in care, going up to the 12-month mark, children in non-kinship homes who are still in care at the beginning of each 3-month interval and who have not yet moved are still more likely to experience their first move than their kinship-placed counterparts. But there is this interesting flip that we see around the 12 to 15-month mark. For children who are still in care at the 12-month mark who had not yet experienced a move, it's the children whose initial placement type was kinship care that are more likely now to experience a move or their first move than the children whose initial placement type was in a non-kinship home. So what are the practical implications here? So first, for this system, making greater efforts right off the bat to identify kinship resources could be a good way to help children entering out-of-home care find some stability. Also, as we can see at this 12 to 15-month mark, there could be an opportunity to work with kinship families somewhere towards the end of that first year when we start thinking a little bit more seriously about ASFA rules, about issues related to permanency, be it adoption or kinship or relative guardianship. So when Jennifer and I were going over this material, we acknowledged that a picture like this might or really should spark additional questions about the experiences of children placed in different care types. You might have questions about whether these trends vary depending on how old children are, or whether the movement that we're seeing in the case of children initially placed in non-kinship homes is what we might consider quote unquote desirable movement with kids moving to kinship care. So that brings us right to the third benefit of the major outcomes report that we want to highlight today.
That's me. So the third benefit of the major outcomes report is one that we think should be inspirational and not frustrating, and that is that, just as Sara said, that when you see what's typical of your system, you can relax a little bit when you see that there seems to be stability over time, but it is unlikely that you will be satisfied with that set of information and that alone. It will always trigger you to ask more questions. And that curiosity is what we all rely on in our efforts to get better. You have to care enough to ask the next question and then be able to access, with both through your human capital and also the resources available to you, the answers to the next set of questions that sate your curiosity and help you decide what you want to do with the information that you are gathering. So one of the things that we want to point out is that the major outcomes report is sort of the distillation and the standardization of a set of questions that we know people care a lot about, but it's not all the questions. The fact is that it, just as I said before, sort of starts a series of cascading next things I want to know. And it sits on a data file that enables you to fairly easily ask and answer those additional questions. So if, for example, in the slide that Sara just showed, you were very interested in this group of kids that was moving so quickly after placement when they were not in kinship care, you might want to know a little bit more about those children. How old are they? why did they come into care? When they moved, where was their next placement? Any of those questions are answerable if you go directly to the data file that produces this sort of summary level aggregated data that answers the basic foundational questions. The other benefit or that's associated with your accessing the major outcomes report is not only the data file on which this information sits, but also there is a education arm of the data center that's dedicated to working to promote capacity building and broader access to resources that help folks at all levels of leadership and management in child welfare systems be equipped with the skills they need to ask and answer questions that will allow them to systematically gather information from available data, both administrative or qualitative data that you can get from case review, but to gather that in a systematic way that is grounded in our priority concepts and that allows you to obtain more information about what's going on in your system in a way that transforms that knowledge into actionable evidence to support change. Because hearkening back to the title of the slideshow, we understand that in order for outcomes to improve, you have to do something different. And figuring out what to do and when and for whom requires careful measurement and also the skills that allow you to undertake that measurement correctly. So the major outcomes report is one resource that contributes to that effort. It sits on a second resource that allows you to ask and answer more specific question, and it's connected to the data center itself, and its education and training arm, which is a broader resource, which can be used to continue to explore and to explore your curiosity about your system and how to use that knowledge to structure continuous improvement. At every juncture, we and the resources that we work with are encouraging you to ask and answer questions that will continue to fuel your continuous effort to improve the outcomes for the children and families that you are serving.
Okay, so let's do some recapping and just talk about what the major outcomes report is and what it isn't. So the major outcomes report provides fundamental evidence about outcomes for children and families, right? We've been very clear about that. Specifically, the major outcomes report will tell you about admission and exit trends, lengths of stay in foster care, duration, placement stability, permanency, and reentry. This is most definitely what the major outcomes report is. But we understand that child welfare managers need to know more than that, right? They need to know about the extent to which there is adherence to the expected process of care. One example is whether children and families are having the opportunity to meet together with other system stakeholders soon after children are placed into care. They need to know about the quality of the services that are being delivered. For example, where there are evidence-based models in place, managers will want to know if those models are being implemented with fidelity. And child welfare managers also need to know about the system's capacity to deliver care that adheres to the expected standards, that's the process of care, and at the expected level of quality. An easy example here has to do with issues of caseload and workload. The major outcomes report does not tell you about performance related to the process of care, the quality of care, or a system's capacity to deliver care. But, and this is a big one, it's our belief that a system's ability to make smart strategic investments and quality improvement plans has everything to do with the evidence the system used to make those decisions. The major outcomes report provides sound evidence about system performance that then allows child welfare managers to consider whether investments should be made in either the process of care or the quality of care or the capacity to deliver care or some combination of the three. The major outcomes report will also help system managers understand the extent to which investments in any of these areas are moving outcomes in the desired direction. So let's just do a little bit more review, because that's what we're all about at the data center. We reiterate. So we just talked about 3 of the main benefits of the major outcomes report. We talked about internalizing the working knowledge of system dynamics, right? By understanding what's typical, it becomes easier to know when performance has really shifted in either direction, either gotten better, perhaps in the wake of a new improvement plan, or gotten worse unexpectedly. Knowing what's typical helps you make predictions, right? When patterns are durable over time, we have no reason to expect they will change unless the system starts doing something different. We also talked about how the major outcomes report can make clear where there are opportunities for targeted improvement efforts. Inevitably, there will be more in which a system can invest than there are dollars or time to invest. But those tough decisions, we believe, can be made easier and be made better if they're made with clear evidence about where there are opportunities to make the change. This gets back to our measure twice, cut once. I don't know if that's really an analogy, but the title of the webinar. So thank you. Lastly, we talked about some of the other resources associated with the major outcomes report. Access to the underlying data file can be enormously useful for systems, particularly those that have the internal capacity to work with the data in that way. But for those systems that don't have that capacity, the folks at the data center like Jennifer and myself and our colleague Lily and others, we are also trained educators who are regularly dispatched around the country to help system staff build the capacity they need to generate and use the evidence of this kind, or use evidence of this kind for better decision making. So the folks on the line this morning who received the sample major outcomes report, we want to underscore for you that the sample you received provides some of the information in the major outcomes report, but not all of the nuance that comes in the full expression of the report. The major outcomes report is organized in a way, as you know, to give you information about system performance that speaks to the issues that we raised today, looking at outcomes longitudinally, using diagnostically relevant groups. But the major outcomes report will also pay attention to the administrative entities that matter to you. It might be geographic regions. For other systems, it could be private agencies. We happen to have a number of data center members who are using versions of the major outcomes report currently, some of them for several years now and others just more recently. So if you're on the line and you think that this kind of report could be a good fit for your system, but you'd like to talk to some others who have been using it already to see how their system may have benefited from using this kind of report, to make sure, let's be honest, that it's not just one more report that you're piling on to a pile of reports, we're more than happy to help make some connections so that you can talk to those people and hear what their experience has been. Take it home, Jennifer.
Following up on that, thank you, Sarah. If you are a member state and then you recently received a sample of the major outcome report, and if you're not, and it also came with some guidance about how to use it. If you're not a member and you'd like to see more, please be in touch with us. We have a sample that we could circulate that might be of interest to you, or if you'd like to join the data center, please feel free to contact us after the webinar. You can email Lily Alpert. She introduced us. Her email is here, and she would be glad to talk to you about what those next steps would be. I think I'm going to turn over to Lily because I think she may have been collecting questions. And if you have some that you have not yet asked, feel free to type them in, and we will do our best to answer them.
Well, thank you so much. This is Lily. Thanks so much to Jennifer and Sarah for the presentation today. We've got 12 minutes to the hour, and so we have a little more time together for Jennifer and Sarah to take your questions. As we mentioned, please type them into your GoToWebinar question box, and we'll get to as many as we can. And while we're waiting for a couple to come in, I'll just reflect on one that I received at the start of the session that says, I didn't receive a copy of my state's outcomes report. Can I access it somewhere? So that's a great question. I think what I'd like to do there, we just need to think of a systematic way to get those out. There are over 100 people on the line today, which is fantastic. And I want to just think of a systematic way to get those out to people. So if you're interested in receiving a copy of your state's major outcomes report and you haven't, please send me an email at the address you see on your screen here, and I'll think of the best way to access that, to get that to you. Really, it's just a matter of making sure that this webinar was open to anyone this morning. We just want to make sure that the recipient is someone who should be receiving this kind of data, and I just need to figure out a way to systematize that. But please send me a request and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I'm seeing a couple of other questions coming in. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to write some in. Someone writes, we received our major outcomes report in Excel. Is there a plan to have these in a web-based format? So for the time being, this is a report that lives in the format of an Excel workbook. And as Sara and Jennifer mentioned earlier, that Excel-based version is the version that's been used so successfully in the field. For those of you who are data center members, this report is an iteration of many of the types of things that you can also, questions you might also be able to answer using the FCDA web tool. And so that's an existing web-based platform that, that you can use to create these kinds of reports as well, or similar ones. The other thing that's possible is that because it's in an Excel-based format, I assume there are possible ways to use the major outcomes report in this Excel format to back up to platforms you might use in your system that project Excel-based data into a web-based format. We're working on those innovations at the data center, but don't have one currently. And in the meantime, systematic updates of this file is the format that it exists in. Someone asked, oh, we've got a bunch of questions. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to scroll through these one at a time. Someone asked, and Jennifer and Sara, I'll field a couple of these for you. I know you've been talking for a while. Please feel free to chime in if I'm missing any important answers. Someone writes, does the report include the % of protective custodies taken in relation to the number of indicated victims, getting at the population? So as you noticed in the examples that Sara and Jennifer gave today, the sample that we sent out to states and the sample that we've used in a number of states pertains to the foster care population, right? The starting date of the experience is the day the child comes into foster care, and we're looking at the speed and the likelihood of things that happen to children once they're placed in care. You're absolutely right that there is a set of critical parallel questions that pertain to the CPS population, right? We want to know about other likelihoods. What's the likelihood that a child who's referred to the hotline will get screened in? What's the likelihood that a screen-in will go down the investigation track? What's the likelihood that an investigation will be substantiated? What's the likelihood that a substantiated child will be placed? Those are all events that take place before the onset, so to speak, of foster care. The multi-state foster care data archive, off of which these reports are one, is a foster care archive. But we've worked, and in a lot of states, to synthesize their child protection data in the same longitudinal format to be able to ask those kinds of questions. So that's the long way of saying the answer to your question is yes, it's definitely possible. It's a matter of receiving those CPS data from your state and working with them in a similar way in order to ask and answer questions about events during the child protective experience, in addition to events during the foster care experience. Someone's asking how much of the raw data can one download into Excel. So for the sake of efficiency and to avoid overload, in the major outcomes report, we typically provide the rate or the summary number instead of the raw data that are used to calculate that finding, right? Instead of the actual numerators and denominators or the actual counts of children incorporated into each analysis. That's just for the sake of efficiency. You could certainly ask for tabs in a cross-regional workbook that would create the counts in addition to the percents. But you can also, as I think this person might be alluding to, download the actual cell file off of which these data are calculated from the FCDA web tool itself if you're a member with access. And if you're doing that, from there, the sky is really the limit. We'd be happy to provide technical guidance on how to get that done. Someone writes, we need a clear understanding of what the cohort is for reentry. Is it an exit cohort or an entry cohort? For example, does 2015 represent the year of admission or the year of exit? Great question. In this particular example, reentry is calculated off an exit cohort. It's one of the rare examples where an exit cohort is one of the possible appropriate risk sets to examine reentry. Of all the children who left care in a given year, what percent came back within a year? What this person may be reflecting on is that it's a slightly different from the federal measure for reentry, which, if I'm correct, asks of all the children who entered care within a specific year and left to reunification or relative within 1 year, what percent came back in the following year? It's an equally important question, an equally viable question to ask about the likelihood of reentry. It just takes a 2-year window to observe all of that happening. You need 1 year to allow all the children to come in, and you need another. I'm sorry, Jennifer? Yeah, right, a 3-year window. You need 1 year for all the children to come in. You need 1 year to observe all the children who will exit within 1 year. And then you need another additional year to observe them coming back within 1 year of exit. There's nothing wrong with that measure. Certainly you all need to compute it for the feds. And that could be something you might want to customize your major outcomes report to answer that question instead of the exit cohort-based question we're asking here, and that can certainly be done. As Jennifer mentioned a moment ago, along with, for those of you who received the sample report, you received some information about how to use it and how to interpret it. In that guidance are some examples of typical customizations that states have done to this report, and and adjustments to the exact question being asked can be one of those customizations, so I encourage you to take a look there. Got 4 more minutes here. I want to see if we can answer another couple. Someone asked a great logistical question. I came on a few minutes late. Will the audio recording of the webinar be available? Yes, it will. We'll post the webinar recording. We'll post the slides in the coming week or so. We'll send that notification out to everybody who registered here today. And yes, the PowerPoint slides will be attached to that. We've got a couple extra minutes here. Any other questions? Last moment to enter a question into the GoToWebinar screen. I'll take one more. This question says, what types of CPS data would we need to send you to be able to use with your tools? Is it NCANs? It can be, but in my experience, and Jennifer, actually, maybe you or Sarah want to answer this question. My understanding is that we don't take the NCANs extracts. We ask for those data the same way we ask for foster care data straight from the electronic system. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
So the answer is yes. We'd ask you for your CPS data in the same kind of format that we ask for your foster care data.
Right. So it's usually a series of tables like screened in reports, an allegation table, an investigation table, a disposition table, things like that. And from that, we derive the information that will allow us to create sort of the partner longitudinal file that can then also be connected to the foster care file.
Right.
Right. And just to be clear, I think it is, though, we ask for those tables, but there's no expectation that anyone on the child welfare systems end is knitting them together in a particular way. So when we say in a particular format, we just mean the raw tables, and then it's on us to use the processes that we've developed over time to knit them together so that they can be used to answer questions in the same way that our foster care spell files are used to answer questions.
Yep, that's right.
Right, and we work with the state partner closely to make sure that we have the correct identifiers, to make sure that those records are linked correctly, and that involves a little bit back and forth between us and the state or county partner. All right, well, I've got 1 minute here. I want to make sure we end right on time. I want to thank everybody once more for being here with us today. Thanks so much to our presenters, Jennifer and Sarah, for taking us through this document and helping us to learn about what the kinds of evidence it can provide for your system and how that evidence can be used to fuel the ongoing process of making system improvements designed to improve outcomes for children and families in the child welfare system. Here on the screen, you still see my name and email. I'm Lily Alpert, also at Chapin Hall. Please email me at lalpert@chapinhall.org with any other questions, comments, anything about working with the data center or helping pursue this idea of developing a major outcomes report for your state or county, be happy to talk to you more at any time. We'll send out the link to the recording. We'll send out the slides. If you're not already registered for the data center's newsletter, that's a wonderful way to stay updated on more events like this. And we'll end right on time. Thanks for everyone so much for being here today, and please keep in touch and have a great rest of the week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.